Good morning, everyone. Please rise for our national anthem. Thank you.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Thank you to the 2018 Upper School Choir for that wonderful production of our national anthem. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Janki Patel, president of our senior class of 2021 and Upper School Student Council. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our 2020 Veterans Day Assembly. We take time on this day to remind ourselves about the many veterans that have valiantly served our country. We will hear the annual proclamation from the President of the United States, and we'll hear a story of one honored veteran, as told by his daughters. At this time, we'd like to recognize all veterans in the Brownell Talbot community, especially two members of the BT faculty and staff. Mr. Dan Coffey, First Lieutenant, United States Air Force, and Mr. Bill Harrell, First Lieutenant, United States Air Force. Mr. Coffey, Mr. Harrell, and any veterans in our online audience, thank you all for your service. I'd now like to invite Akshay Mehta to read the Presidential Proclamation for 2020.
Thank you, Janki. Ladies and gentlemen, the Presidential Proclamation on National Veterans and Military Families Month, 2020. Our nation's service members, past and present, and their families represent the very best of America. Motivated by patriotism and love of our country, our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen, and space warfighters serve at home and abroad with professionalism, ingenuity, integrity, and devotion. Their families always stand beside them in their missions as they transition to civilian life. During National Veterans and Military Families Month, we celebrate the loved ones of our country's men and women in uniform and recognize the sacrifices they have made in support of our nation's heroes. When I first took office, I pledged to armed forces that I would always have their backs, and that means providing for military families as well. The demands and challenges of military life are shared by the loved ones of our heroes. Spouses, parents, siblings, and children often shoulder increased burdens and responsibilities when their servicemen and women are called to duty. Military families, and especially spouses who have had to endure the stress of frequent relocations and deal with job searches under state licensing regulations that can prevent them from working in their chosen occupations. To address this issue, my administration eliminated unnecessary and cumbersome red tape that stifled career opportunities for many military spouses, and the Department of Defense has implemented programs to enhance childcare opportunities for military families. Too many veterans carry painful memories and bear physical and emotional scars from their service. We will never forget our veterans who are suffering from mental health issues or the military families that are left behind by veteran suicide. As president, I have prioritized changing the culture surrounding mental health and promoting a society that recognizes the infinite value and purpose of every life. Last year, I mobilized every available federal resource to develop and implement the President's Roadmap to empower veterans and end a national tragedy of suicide. I also fought and secured a record $8.6 billion in funding for mental health services in the most recent Department of Veteran Affairs Appropriations Bill. In October, I signed the Commander John Scott Hannon Veterans Mental Health Care Improvement Act, which will bolster these effects even further. Like never before, we are using a whole-of-government approach to better understand and prevent suicide. No American warrior should ever be forgotten, and no military family should ever be left behind. Since the beginning of my administration, it has been a top priority and my solemn pledge to honor and equip and protect our service members, veterans, and their families. My commitment has not wavered. America's military might is essential to our safety, prosperity, and national security. Caring for the brave Americans in our armed forces and their families and upholding our sacred obligation to those who have served with honor is the least we can do for those who have given so much for so many. This month, we pledge our gratitude to every man and woman currently serving this nation in uniform, to all of our veterans who help preserve and defend our precious freedom, and to every family member who shares in the service and sacrifice of military life. My administration will never stop fighting to enhance and improve the quality of life for these exceptional Americans. Now, therefore, I, Donald J. Trump, President of the United States of America, by virtue of authority vested in me by the Constitution and the laws of the United States, do hereby proclaim November 2020 as National Veterans and Military Families Month. I encourage all communities, all sectors of society, and all Americans to acknowledge and honor the service, sacrifices, and contributions of veterans and military families for what they have done and for what they do every day to support our great nation. In witness whereof, I have hereunto set my hand in this 30th day of October, in the year our Lord 2020, and of our independence of the United States of America, the 245th. Donald J. Trump. Thank you. Please welcome sophomore Vice President Rayon Satar.
It is my pleasure to welcome our special guest speakers. Lori Krejci is a special friend of Charlie Sherbring and the Sherbring family. Charlie is in the 7th grade and is a member of Mr. Kaler's advisory. Miss Krejci and her sister Carol Krejci will share the story of their father, Command Sergeant Major John J. Krejci. Sergeant Krejci was a tail gunner on the B-24 bomber in Europe during World War II. He flew on 10 missions before his plane was shot down and became a prisoner of war on April 29, 1944. Lori and Carol, thank you for joining us today to honor your father.
Probably, the 1980s sometime?
Least, yeah.
When Dad first started to talk about his military experiences, especially his time as a POW in Germany.
Well, and there was no such thing as PTSD back then. You came home, you sucked it up, and got a job and went back to life. And I remember my mom talking one time, they were at a POW forum of some sort, and the wives were at their own little group, and they were talking about the high rate of divorce among POWs. And my mom and her two friends looked at each other and said, well, nobody told us that. We stuck it out. We were there for the whole thing. And one of the wives had actually even caught her husband trying to commit suicide a couple of times. But it was probably in the 80s when Dad started to, he retired from the railroad. He worked for the Union Pacific Railroad before the war and served his time and came home after the war, got his job back and worked there for 40 some years. And it was the old shops down where the CHI Center is now down in downtown Omaha, is where the shops used to be. And when Dad started getting involved with this organization was when we first started to hear the stories. And for years we were told that Dad was shot down. And we heard him telling a reporter one time that there was, I don't know, 100 planes on this bombing run over Berlin that day.
Something like that. At any rate, they were flying in sort of a formation.
But they were on different levels. And the plane above Dad took some flak, which is what they call the enemy enemy fire. And it came down, clipped the plane, or the wing of Dad's plane, and brought them both down. And so I'm looking at him going, so Dad, you weren't shot down, you fell down. And we never let him live that up. We never let him live that, down.
Yeah, we always made a joke, that the plane above him fell down and Dad wasn't smart enough to get out of the way.
Yeah.
And so, but when his plane came down, well, let me backtrack a sec. There was one or two guys that chose to bail.
There was 10 guys on the crew, 3 parachuted. They were all killed.
All the ones that parachuted out were killed. The guys who chose to go down with the plane, like Dad, all survived. But when he crawled out of the wreckage, there was a farmer
That's
sta-
his plane.
standing there with a gun, waiting to escort them to.
Well, because he was mad as a hornet because the plane messed up his crop. So Dad said he had a big old blunderbuss, Dad called it. And the guys all crawled out of the plane and they're like, uh-oh, we're in big trouble now. And luckily, actually, all the guys who were taken prisoner survived the war and made it home and grew into old age, whereas the 3 who parachuted were killed by the enemy, and that was that. So I don't know if there's a lesson there or not.
Yeah, I don't know either. I think they were just lucky with the way the plane landed. But the officers were taken to one prison camp, and the other guys were taken to a different prison camp.
Oh, I'd forgotten that.
Dad went to Stalag 17B,
I'll be right.
which was in Krems, Austria. And I don't know if you remember, but you probably don't, you're probably too young, but way back when, there was a movie called Stalag 17. And with William Holden. And the script for that movie was written by a guy who was in prison camp with my father. And we always asked Dad, well, did you ever try to escape? And he said, no, because the guys who did never survived.
They never made it, yeah.
Yeah, never made it, beyond the walls of the prison camp. And so he said there was very little incentive to try and escape.
Well, and the guys in the German camps, at least in my dad's camp, really didn't have it as bad physically as the guys in the Japanese camps, who were really, really tortured and abused. A lot like you hear about the Vietnam vets and people like John McCain, who was in the Hanoi Hilton. Dad's abuse was starvation and a lot of mind games. The guy who wrote the premise for the TV show Hogan's Heroes was in my dad's prison camp. He was in his barracks. And Dad said some of that was legit, that they would play mind games and they would jerk the Germans around. He goes, and the Germans, he called them the Nazis. He goes, they weren't really too bright, some of them. And so Dad said some of those characters were pretty legit. But Dad loved Hogan and Klink and Sergeant Schultz.
Yeah.
Yeah, because, and Dad said he used to get a potato for a meal, and they ate the inside for one meal and the peel for another meal. And Dad would never touch another carrot after the war.
Or cabbage. Oh my God.
Cabbage.
Hated cabbage.
Rutabagas. Potato was probably the only vegetable he ate after the war that he had eaten during prison camp. And if mom wanted sauerkraut, which she loved, our neighbor would make it and Mom would go over there because Dad would not allow it in the house. He couldn't tolerate the smell.
But he never seemed to hold the starvation against anyone. I remember hearing him say, well, they didn't have enough food to feed the people. So prisoners of war were pretty low on the list of who was going to get fed.
Yeah.
And so he didn't seem to bother him. Now, the family joke is always about when Dad was coming home, and Mom and Dad had been engaged before he left for the war. And so when Mom knew for sure that Dad was coming home, she went on a diet.
I told him that. Mom still outweighed him.
Yeah.
Really ticked her off.
Dad wrote Mom at least once a day, at least, if not more, the whole time he was a pre-OW or away.
Because they were high school sweethearts.
Yeah, they were literally high school sweethearts at Omaha South High. And so anyway, at some point, Dad's letters stopped. And nobody knew for sure what had happened, if he was dead or alive or whatever. And eventually my grandmother got a letter saying that Dad was a POW. And it still took time before they actually got a letter from Dad. Well, of course, that was a different time. And so the mailman was aware of the fact that Mom hadn't gotten any letters from Dad for a long time. And then eventually that he had been declared a POW, but didn't know anything else about it. Well, the one day when he realized he had the first letter from Jack for a long time, he was so excited to deliver that letter that he actually knocked on the door and insisted on giving the letter to my mom in person.
And they weren't even married yet, so that was pretty cool.
Right.
Because Mom always joked that Dad was engaged during the war and she wasn't. Because she was hedging her bets in case Dad didn't come home. You know, she was kind of ornery. She didn't really do that, but she loved to tell people that. And they were married for 63 years, and they adored each other. But my dad absolutely worshipped the ground my mom walked on. He thought she was the cat's meow.
I don't think he ever looked at another woman
the rest of his life. Yeah. But I was laughing about this picture. You can see my dad's really skinny and looking pretty forlorn. And this was taken when he was taken prisoner, and it was blown up by this friend of ours. And then I got, just to show you how life got better, this was taken about 60 years later, and Dad's looking much better. This is an article that was in the World Herald about him. And he was about 220 then, compared to what 110 in that other picture. So yeah, life got better for Dad. He filled out nicely, yes. But he was on a bombing run over Berlin, and it was not his first one. He'd done several, and he was shot down on April 29th of 1944. And he was liberated, is it May 12th of 1945?
Well, in 1945, I'm not sure of the date.
But he hit the States on June 12th and married our mother on July 12th. He didn't waste any time. And again, he didn't really talk about anything, but I don't know how long he was home before he joined the National Guard. And then he quit that and joined the Army Reserve.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. It seems to me that he was in the Guard for a while when I was small. But he liked the reserves better than the National Guard.
Dad loved the military, and I think that aside from raising his family, there's nothing in the world that was more important to my father than the service that he gave to our country. He lived through Pearl Harbor. He was at a roller rink on Sunday morning when they got the news of Pearl Harbor, and Dad hadn't enlisted or anything at that point. But he was of that greatest generation where nothing was more important than serving your country and dying for your country. And he was ready to do that. It meant that much to him. And it did until the day he died. We always joked that we could salute before we could walk. And we always had a flag flying in our yard or on the house or whatever, because Dad took that so seriously, and he was so proud of his service.
Yeah, and if he saw a flag flying somewhere that wasn't being done properly, that it just drove him crazy. You know, if the flag was flying at night without being lit up or something like that.
Or if it was frayed, he would stop and tell him, you need to take that flag down. Dad he'd go bananas if a flag was being disrespected. In fact, I wonder what he would do now when people kneel for the flag. Doesn't bother me, but I think my dad would go bonkers.
Yeah.
But he also, the plane he flew, people don't hear about it very often. They always hear about the B-17s. And Dad flew a B-24, which they called what, the Flying Fortress?
I'm not sure. Yeah.
But these pictures were taken, we got these years and years later. These pictures were taken of Dad's plane crash by a young farmer boy. And many, many, many years ago, when he was researching the crashes in the area, he found one of the guys in Dad's bomber crew out in California and sent these pictures to Dad of the plane. And I didn't realize, honestly, how big the planes were until you see the people walking around underneath it. And you're like, holy buckets, that was a big plane.
Yeah, Dad was a tail gunner. So when the plane crashed, he had to jump out of up there. And he said it was a pretty good jump.
About a 2-story jump, I think he said.
Down to the ground.
Yeah. It was, and in this one here, you can see the SS officers walking around underneath the plane. Dad's already gone. They've already taken all the guys prisoner and put them on the march to Krems, Austria. And they were actually, when they were liberated, it was by Patton's army. And Dad said they put the Germans put them on the march shortly before the army got there. And so Dad said they knew something was up. They knew something was going on. And Dad said they could hear the other army coming and they saw the flag. And he said they realized that freedom was over that hill, that was their flag and freedom was coming over the hill for them. And Dad said he'd never been, I don't think he was ever so moved in his life as when he saw freedom coming over that hill and saw the American flag flying above the Nazi flag. And that's part of why the flag was so incredibly important to him, was it represented freedom to him. We're so incredibly proud of Dad, and he became involved with the national organization, the National American Ex-Prisoners of War. And he actually, with a man with just a high school education, rose to national commander and met with presidents and met with John McCain. And he got to lay a wreath at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And he had a lot of incredible experiences in his life that were good because of such a horrible experience. So it was kind of a gift that he got that later in life.
Yeah, well, and it was an accident of time, because the organization of American ex-POWs was celebrating an anniversary in 92, when Dad
They were 50 years old, I think, when they started out as the survivors of Bataan and Corregidor, and then it morphed into this whole big organization.
But Dad was president national commander that year that they celebrated this anniversary. And so they had, and I saw this in the Congressional Record one time, where they had to get special permission to have a special anniversary ceremony in Statuary Hall. And we have a video of part of that ceremony. And here's our father standing there with
Bob Dole,
John
John McCain.
McCain,
There's a couple of others. I can't remember.
Senator Inouye from Hawaii. And there were several other fairly recognizable names,
Yeah.
who were senators and House members at that time. And so here's my dad there with all these important people. And when he, it was also, and then every year used to be anyway, the heads of the various military organizations go to meet the president. And so Dad got to meet President
Clinton.
No, H.W. Bush. But the story goes that he tried to enlist in the Marines, and the Marines wouldn't take him because he had flat feet. So he went across the hall and enlisted in the Army.
Not sure I knew that.
Yeah.
Well, and interestingly enough, Dad has had a baby brother, Bob, who was a couple years younger. And Bob was in the infantry in World War II, and Bob was taken prisoner during the Battle of the Bulge. And so both of the boys in the family were taken prisoner, and our grandparents were divorced, and so we never knew. Grandma would get information about one boy and Grandpa would get another, and believe me, my grandparents didn't talk this over at all. They would rather die than see each other. But it was interesting that they were siblings, but they were in different camps, and Uncle Bob was infantry, and
Dad was in the Army Air Corps.
Yeah.
Because you remember at that time, the Air Force was not a separate entity.
It
It was-
barely existed.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was part of the Army.
Yeah. And we still have, my uncle married and had 2 sons, and one of his sons is still living. We see him once a year. He lives out in Idaho, and he's not quite as invested in all this experience as we are, but he's nonetheless proud of his father.
Lori and Carol, thank you for sharing the story of your father, an honored veteran of our armed services. And thank you for being an extended part of our Brownell Talbot family. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our program for today. If you know any veterans, please take a moment to thank them for their service, and also to ask them about their story. It will be well worth your time. If there are any veterans in your family who would be willing to share his or her story at a future Veterans Day program, please have them contact me at the school. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and God bless the United States.